If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick-out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, it will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. This oft-quoted excerpt from Roald Dahl's The Twits is a nice sentiment, but is it true? Do ugly thoughts twist and distort the face and body such that nastiness on the inside is reflected physically on the outside? The political left's public reaction to the assassination of Charlie Kirk was one of particular and unique ugliness. It was perhaps the reaction, the celebration, jubilation, exhilaration at the murder of a father of 2 young children and the calls for more violence that immediately followed, perhaps more so than the event itself, that shocked people around the world. While mass vigils filled stadiums full of mourners in the United States, in England, Japan, and South Korea, anti-immigration protesters carried images of Charlie alongside symbols of national pride. Thousands of other people, however, were unable to contain the sheer joy they felt at the murder of a man whose great crime was disagreeing with them politically, yet always willing to engage in civil debate. The sentence for Charlie Kirk's willingness to have those civil discussions was death, and the left, collectively, cheered. With a few exceptions who denounced his murder, even those that didn't cheer largely remained silent and refused to condemn it. Ugly. I can think of many words to describe this phenomenon, but high amongst them is the word ugly. Let us test the veracity of that Roald Dahl quote. Does having ugly beliefs, thinking ugly thoughts, saying ugly words, and committing acts of unspeakable ugliness warp and contort the physical form? In this video, I will demonstrate with scientific data the ugliness of the left, from appearance to thoughts to actions, and through the use of mass-scale dataset analysis, provide an explanation for the lower levels of violence typically ascribed to the left compared to the right. The answer is not that the left is in any way less violent in thought, as is often claimed, but rather that they are less competent at enacting violence, yet more likely to believe that violence is a justified course of moral action. Political ugliness. But what does political ugliness look like, and what forms does it take? Despite being oft said to be in the eye of the beholder, physical ugliness is in many ways easier to assess than ugliness of the mind. Thus, let us answer this question that has persistently plagued public discourse. Is one side of politics uglier than the other in their beliefs, thoughts, actions, and appearances? Starting from the outside, the body, before we delve deeper into the mind, and ultimately, the soul. But before we talk about the ugliness of politics, a particularly dark subject, let me tell you about a way to bring a little bit more brightness into your own daily life by helping you rest and recharge just about anywhere. This video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. Everyone knows that getting a good night's sleep is important, but research has also shown that taking a 10 to 20 minute nap during the daytime can help improve cognitive functioning, memory, and learning, which is where Manta Sleep's 100% blackout sleep masks come in, allowing you to escape from the daily stressors of the real world and escape into your own little pocket dimension of relaxation. Manta Sleep's masks are completely adjustable for any head size or shape, put zero pressure on your eyelids, and are made of soft and breathable, but tough stuff. Manta Sleep Steam can be warmed up for cozy comfort, while Manta Sleep Cool can be chilled for refreshing relaxation, and Manta Sleep Sound includes built-in Bluetooth speakers for you to listen to long videos about statistics like this one, to lull you softly to sleep, which is perfect for me so I can catch some Z's and catch up with my own favorite content, which is, of course, other long videos about scientific subjects or people getting violently angry about politics, of which this video is both. Whether you're looking for a sounder night's sleep or a convenient way to get in a couple extra winks during the daytime, Manta Sleep is a simple, easy, and most importantly, comfortable way to supercharge your slumber, maximize your energy, and just improve your day. If you're ready for a better night's sleep and a great way to improve your energy, concentration, and cognition, then check out Manta Sleep by clicking the link in the description or using the QR code on screen and use code AYDIN at checkout, that's AYDIN at checkout, to get 10% off your order of the Manta Sleep products of your choice. Thank you so much to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. So, now that we're equipped with a comfortable way to turn off the stressors of the real world, let's take a peek behind the mask and look at one of the most stressful things in people's lives today. Let's take a deep dive into the facts, science, and statistics of the ugliness of politics. For years now, pundits and people alike have spoken of the ugliness of the political left. From oversized problem glasses to eccentric hair colors and cuts, identifiable social markers which have been claimed by some commentators to serve functionally as a form of human aposematism, a signal to others that the person displaying these arguably ugly symbols is in some way unpleasant, unhinged, or even dangerous, much as how poisonous rainforest frogs display their bright colors as a message to other animals to avoid them. More recently, searches for the term septum theory or nose ring theory have increased, sparking intense debate as to its validity. While discussed in some circles for years, going back as far as 2017 at least, the subject became a hot one on social media sites such as TikTok and X in 2025. The theory posits that people with septum piercings, particularly women, are more likely to be mentally ill, aggressive, self-centered, and cruel, and almost always towards men. Swamy et al. 2012 found that both women and men rated male and female models with facial piercings as less physically attractive and intelligent than those without piercings. The more piercings the model had, the dumber and uglier they were rated as being. People with piercings were also perceived of as more likely to lean to the political left. No matter why someone chooses to get facial piercings, the social message that they send to the world in doing so is the same, that one is on the political left and probably also stupid and seemingly intentionally ugly. While people with piercings are seen as less attractive and more politically leftist, before septum theory, brightly colored hair was oft identified as a physical symbol of political affiliation. A study of available data provided on OkCupid profiles by Dutton and Kierkegaard 2022 found a very strong correlation of 0.54 between having brightly colored hair at any point and being left-wing politically. Further, there was a moderate correlation of 0.33 between ever having dyed one's hair an unnatural color and having depression, anxiety, or another mental health concern.
You are kind of saying to people, stay away. I remember I was in Prisma in Oulu shopping, and there was this appalling woman with blue hair and whatever, and everything about her was screaming at me, stay away.
Facial piercings and unnatural hair colors are distinct choices made by individuals, not birthmarks. Intentionally or not, these symbols indicate to others that the person displaying them is on the political left, because they are typically donned by those on the political left. Unlike piercings and fluorescent hair, however, much of our appearance is not a choice, instead being a roll of the genetic dice. So, can one's politics be determined by that dice roll? Are people on the right or left seen as more or less attractive on average, sans nose rings and vibrant hair? Rule and Embody 2010 conducted 3 studies to determine if physical attractiveness was related to political orientation. American university students were provided with grayscale photos of white Democrat and Republican candidates from across the nation, as well as photos of members of collegiate Democrat and Republican clubs, and were asked to guess whether the photographed person leaned left or right politically. Additionally, the attractiveness of the person in each photo was rated both by independent trained coders and by study participants. Regardless of their own political leanings and sex, subjects were able to predict the political party of both politicians and students alike significantly more accurately than at random, based solely on their physical appearance. A similar study from Samochowicz, Wanka, and Fielder 2010 asked students at the University of Basel to predict the political party of different politicians from across Germany, based on photos and neutral video clips. After excluding subjects who reported being familiar with a particular politician from the sample, 70% of their guesses were correct, indicating that people from across the world can tell just by looking at someone what his or her political leanings are likely to be with decent accuracy. Humans are notoriously biased, however, so surely these results are just a product of conscious or subconscious biases, right? Well, Rasmussen, Ludke, and Clemenson 2023 used a deep learning approach with convolutional neural networks to assess if a machine could similarly detect someone's politics just by looking at them. The researchers used over 3,000 grayscale facial photographs of candidates in the 2017 Danish municipal election, removing those with beards that obscured their facial features. When a full photo with a background was used, the network was 61% accurate in guessing a politician's leanings and 65% accurate when the face was cropped out of the background. Again, significantly better than at random. The authors then took the faces of the politicians rated as most likely to be right or left wing by the network and transformed them into composite images. In addition to the conservative faces just appearing to smile more, morphology analysis rated the female conservative composite face as significantly more attractive than the female liberal composite face. There was no significant difference in the attractiveness scores of the composite male faces. Thus, it seems that even a completely impartial observer looking only at face symmetry and morphology can not only determine one's politics by their facial features, but tend to rate female conservative politicians as more physically attractive on average than their left-leaning counterparts. Both people and machines thereby can determine someone's politics, literally, at face value. And they tend to rate those on the left as less physically attractive. But why? Could there be some truth to that Roald Dahl quote? That someone who has ugly thoughts will appear unattractive on the outside, while people who have good thoughts will appear beautiful, no matter what they actually look like? Again, it was immediately evident that if nothing else, conservatives tended to smile more. But is this difference in physical attractiveness on the outside also present on the inside? That is a difficult question to answer. What are ugly thoughts? Well, one of the ugliest, surely, is the desire to cause the suffering of others, or the enjoyment of others' suffering. This subject, reignited in the light of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is one of the most persistent questions that has plagued modern politics. Who is more violent in their thoughts and in their actions? The answer, much like the question itself, is a bit complicated. But, as I will now demonstrate, does not lie in empathy nor performative compassion, but rather in incompetence. The question of who perpetrates more political violence is more complex than it appears prima facie, as those seeking to answer it typically only focus on actual completed violence and its resulting casualties. But those outcomes are not the complete picture, as they rarely include failed attempts that are either not carried out or, thankfully, manage to result in minimal harm. We must ask then, who intends to commit more violence? This is, obviously, more difficult to answer, but a good way to measure by proxy is to look beyond casualties and instead also look at the lack of casualties compared to attempts and plans. To do this, we need to look at mass-scale datasets, as many scholars have before. Jasko et al., 2022, for example, conducted a review of recognized terrorist incidents using both global and US data collected between 1948 and 2019 to determine which political groups tend to commit more violent acts. Their first study assessed data from the profiles of individual radicalization in the United States, or PIRIS dataset. PIRIS contains information on over 1,500 individuals with a history of involvement in domestic extremist activities, identified as affiliated with either a left-wing, right-wing, or Islamist ideology between 1948 and 2018. They found that individuals who identified with a left-wing ideology had 68% lower odds of engaging in violent versus non-violent radical behaviors compared to individuals with a right-wing or Islamist ideology, who did not differ from each other in their likelihood of engaging in violent action. Specifically, the probability of an attack being motivated by left-wing ideology was 0.33, while that of right-wing violent attack was 0.61, and that of Islamist violent attack 0.62. Immigrants, older individuals, and whites were less likely to engage in violent activity. While at face value, these data appear to indicate that left-wingers commit far fewer violent political acts than do right-wingers or Islamists, it's not exactly that simple. Going further into the Pyrrhus dataset for ourselves, for nonviolent incidents, 12% were perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan, 9% by the Earth Liberation Front, and 8% by the Jewish Defense League, which is classified as a right-wing group, representing the three groups responsible for the most nonviolent events. For violent incidents, 19% were perpetrated by ISIL, 14% by the KKK, and 8% by Al-Qaeda, again representing the three groups responsible for the most violent events. The Klan's last known lynching occurred in 1981, which demonstrates the age of this dataset. Thus, if we restrict the set to only include incidents perpetrated in the last 35 years, my lifetime, a significantly different picture emerges. According to the Pyrrhus dataset, the three most common perpetrators of nonviolent incidents since 1990 were the Earth Defense League at 13%, followed by ISIL, which was responsible for 11% of nonviolent incidences, as was the Animal Liberation Front. Two left-wing groups and one Islamist group. The Klan came in fourth place for nonviolent incidences in this time frame, representing 10% of events. For violent incidents since 1990, the top three perpetrator groups were all Islamist. ISIL at 28%, Al-Qaeda at 11%, and Al-Shabaab at 9%. The KKK came in fourth place again for violent incidents at 7%. In this dataset, left-wing groups were responsible for less than 2% of violent attacks and 26% of non-violent attacks. Right-wing groups were responsible for 34% of violent attacks and the most, 40%, of non-violent attacks. Islamist groups, in turn, were responsible for the most violent attacks, comprising 64%, and the second most non-violent attacks at 34%. If one were to only look at this dataset, it would certainly appear that the left is overwhelmingly non-violent, but also that the right is still only a little over half as violent as our Islamist groups. The reason for this skew is likely due to the characteristics of the Pyrrhus dataset, in which 59% of included groups were right-wing, 23% were left-wing, and 18% were Islamist. That is, there needed to be nearly 3 times as many right-wing groups as Islamist ones in order to find that the right was about half as violent as Islamists, and also more than twice as many right-wing groups as left-wing ones for these findings to be present. In Jasko et al.'s second study, they used data from the Global Terrorism Database, or GTD, which includes 182,848 cases, 55% of which have been associated with a known ideological group. After selecting only groups that were associated with 5 or more attacks, they identified 935 different perpetrator cells active between 1970 and 2019. In total, 49% of the incidents in the GDT were perpetrated by Islamic terrorist groups, such as Hezbollah. 45% were perpetrated by left-wing terrorist groups, such as the Weather Underground, and 6% were perpetrated by right-wing groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, between 1970 and 2019. How can two datasets covering much of the same time span report completely different percentages of violence attributable to left and right-wing groups? Specifically, how can right-wing violence comprise 59% of Pyrrhus, but only 6% of GDT? Beyond the fact that one is a global dataset and the other only a US-based one, there are a variety of factors, from inclusion criteria to categorization, made at the researcher's discretion that represent a clear avenue for researcher bias to enter into any analysis of such events. I should also note that there are errors in both the Pyrrhus and the GT datasets, with many cells lacking important clarifying information. Further, I found at least one group had been mislabeled in the GTD, while another group, Project 7, included in Pyrrhus, is listed as being responsible for 4 violent events, but Project 7 has since been cleared of charges following a federal probe. As such, both Jasko et al.'s analysis and my own of these datasets are potentially flawed as the data are flawed, and categorization is open to interpretation and some degree of researcher choice. So, after going through hundreds of incidents in these massive datasets, here's what my choices for categorization, which did not largely end up differing much from Jasko et al.'s, further indicated. First, I confirmed Jasko et al.'s observations. In the US between 1990 until 2019, as you can see here, violence from either side of the left-right spectrum were dwarfed in terms of death and injury compared to the counts attributable to Islamic extremism. Despite there being a fifth as many violent incidences involving them, Islamist attacks in the US alone since 1990 were responsible for 22 times the number of deaths and 77.6 times as many wounded than were right-wing groups. In comparison, while there were 3.6 times more violent leftist incidents than violent Islamic incidents, Islamic attacks resulted in 80 times more deaths and 366 times as many injuries as left-wing attacks did. Much like the aforementioned trends regarding the overrepresentation of Islamic violence drawn from the GTD, these results were present both in the US and globally. But because I live in the British Isles, I first decided to assess violent incidents attributable to ideology in the UK using the admittedly fallible GTD, and quickly discovered the utility of this particular dataset over Pyrrhus. It includes uncovered or foiled plots as well as completed attacks. Concerning the total number of attempted and completed terrorist attacks in the UK between 1990 and 2019, and setting aside violence attributable to the IRA, as that's its own unique separatist issue,
Chucky Allah! Come out, shiver like it's hands, come out and fight me like a man.
explicitly right-wing groups were slightly less likely to commit and plan acts of violence than were explicitly left-wing ones. If I include anti-Muslim violence as a right-wing phenomenon, which it is not in all cases, while including animal rights and environmental violence as a left-wing phenomenon, which it is in almost all cases, then the same pattern emerges, while the distance between either side and Islamic violence is diminished. That is, in the UK, the left has been responsible for more attempted or completed acts of terrorism than has the right since 1990, after removing Irish separatist violence from the equation. However, neither political orientation was responsible for as much violence as have been Islamists. Once again, comparatively to Islamic violence, the difference between the left and the right in terms of such activity is minimal. But of the two sides, the left has indeed been more violent in its thoughts and its actions. Looking at death and injury caused by these attacks, similarly, neither side compares to Islamic groups in the UK. While 6 deaths and 2 injuries were attributable to neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and anti-Muslim extremists during that time frame, Islamic groups were responsible for 89 deaths and 4 injuries, nearly 15 times the deaths and twice the injuries as various groups and individuals considered broadly right-wing. Despite the left planning and completing more attacks than the right in the UK, however, they did not manage to harm as many people as did the right. That is, in the UK, the left seems to plan more violence, but succeeds at causing death and injury less often than does the right. And once more, both sides' levels of violence are dwarfed by that perpetrated by Islamists. If one looks only at death and injury tolls, which it makes sense to do, then yes, the right is more violent. But in the UK at least, that is only because the left is more likely to fail at carrying violence out. This trend was also present in the United States. I have separated anti-government, anti-Muslim, incel/male supremacist, and sovereign citizen violence into their own categories, as when looking into the individual incidents, they typically did not fall into a simple left-right dichotomy. Violence against the government is inherently somewhat dependent on who is in power, and often is wholly anarchistic in nature. Anti-Muslim attacks have often been perpetrated by Zionists, as much as they have been by right-wingers, and more recently, this trend has obviously changed to favor the left. Incels and male supremacists, while typically also on the right, are targeting a specific group, women, over a specific grievance. And sovereign citizens, while also often right-wing, tend to be of the anarchist variety.
You know what? You're fired, okay? You didn't follow proto. How do you get a job here?
You know what protocol is?
Yeah, I take cops' badges all the time doing it.
As such, I chose to separate these groups and focus instead on core right and left-wing issues for displaying these data. 43 incidents were attributable to anti-government groups, 42 to anti-Muslim groups, and 10 to sovereign citizens, male supremacists, and incels. On the left, the greatest perpetrators of violence since 1990 have been, by far, animal rights and environmental extremists, followed by anti-white extremists, and then anti-police extremists. While rarely mentioned anymore as the zeitgeist has changed, animal rights and environmental violence was not uncommon just a few decades ago, even appearing in popular media of the time, such as The X-Files, which dedicated an episode each to both groups. Given the left's near-complete unwillingness to condemn the so-called Joe Rogan of the left, Hassan Piker, for legal reasons allegedly using a shock collar to keep his dog in frame on his streams for hours on end like a living, breathing Funko Pop.
You would think that this kind of outrage, we would have seen it towards like the genocide and stuff, but this priorities in this world are not where they should be.
No, it wasn't confirmed Hill Kid. It was confirmed that it was a vibration collar, or that the dog had a vibration collar, not even that he used it.
He literally debunked it. He showed the collar on stream. Like, what more can be done?
After Hassan revealed the vibration collar on stream, bad actors attempted to leverage the fact that he put a small piece of tape on the back to conceal his phone number, which is like written in Sharpie on the back of the little vibration box, as evidence that he somehow secretly modified and soldered down shock collar prongs, something that would basically be like impossible to do.
One hand. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
There's no tape. And you can't take those points out. You cannot cut the prongs off.
And you twist them to the left to loosen them. And after that, they just screw off.
That's what I'm saying. The cope is so hard with a lot of people on this.
The electric prongs are taken out of it.
But here's my thing, right?
Oh, I don't want to watch any more of this.
As was their unwillingness to condemn the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
His rhetoric and beliefs were ignorant, uneducated, and sought to disenfranchise millions of Americans.
It is easy to forget that those on the same side of the electrified fence attempted and committed more nonviolent acts of terror in the name of animal rights between the 1990s through 2020 than did ISIL, and since 1948 have been responsible for the second most nonviolent attacks of terror, behind only the Ku Klux Klan. On the right, the greatest perpetrators of violence since 1990 have been anti-abortion activists, followed by white supremacists, and then Trump supporters. But there was not a single year between 9/11/2001 and 2019 wherein there was not at least one left-wing planned or completed attack. However, there were 3 years, 2002, 2010, and 2011, wherein there were no planned nor completed attacks from right-wingers. If we examine this graph of the number of planned and completed attacks since the year 2002 by political orientation, we can quickly see that the two appear to meet and react to each other. Years with more left-wing violence are followed often by years with more right-wing violence, and vice versa, illustrating that the political temperature is highly reactive to what either group perceives as an attack from their enemy. For example, the first major spike in violence since the early 2000s occurred from the right in 2015, which was followed directly by a major spike in left-wing violence in 2016, then a spike in right-wing violence in 2017 and 18, followed by another spike in left-wing violence in 2019. Violence, by political valence, therefore, appears reactionary and reciprocal. But many violent plots are never uncovered because they are never carried out, nor even attempted, and the people or person planning them in no way vocalizes their intent. As such, it is very difficult to determine the true number of attacks that a broad political group is planning. But in the United States, between 2002 and 2019, left-wing groups were very slightly more likely to plan attacks than were right-wing groups, with 82% of detected right-wing plots attempted and 82.5% of detected left-wing plots attempted. However, the effectiveness of these attacks differed significantly. The percentage of right-wing completed attacks that resulted in at least one injury was 64.3%, while 59% of left-wing completed attacks resulted in at least one injury during that same time frame. Data regarding deaths further illustrate this difference, as of completed right-wing attacks during this period, 50% resulted in at least one death, while 29% of completed left-wing attacks resulted in at least one death. One of the reasons, then, why it seems that the right may be more violent than the left is because although the left plans violence to about the same degree, if not more, they are less effective at causing actual harm. This same pattern was present in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Put another way, a right-wing attack is on average 1.72 times more likely to result in a death than is a left-wing attack, and a right-wing attack is 1.09 times more likely to result in an injury than is a left-wing attack, based on trends since 2002. In total, 121 people were killed and 165 people were injured as the result of right-wing violence between 2002 and 2019, while far fewer people were killed, 28, or injured, 64, by left-wing attacks in that time span. If I apply these success rates to completed attacks from the left during this time period, the differences in casualty are still massive, but there are so many variables for this particular analysis to be largely meaningless. Yet, given the consistency of the trend, it is fair to say that because those on the left plan more and cause death and injury less, it is less the case that the right is inherently more violent, but rather instead that it is more competent at violence, while many left-wing plots remain uncompleted, yet plotted all the same. There are also a lot of problems with the way that violent incidents are attributed to a political ideology in statistical analyses of violence. But these datasets, while flawed, do not include things like prison violence, which are often included to seemingly inflate violence from the right, while excluding things like Antifa violence.
There's no Antifa. This is an entirely imaginary organization. There is not an Antifa. This is no different than if they announced they rounded up a dozen Decepticons.
However, by limiting the scope only to terrorism committed by groups, the preponderance of data already indicates that right-wing groups have historically completed more acts of terrorism than have left-wing ones, resulting in greater death and injury. But the left tends to plan just as many crimes as does the right, if not more. The reason it often appears as if the right is more violent at a low-resolution view is because a right-wing violent attack is more likely to result in death and injury, while left-wing attacks are less likely to result in death and injury, leaving likely many left-wing plots unexposed, either because they are not carried out or because they fail to cause any appreciable harm. Therefore, it is not the case that the left, broadly speaking, is somehow uniquely less violent than the right, but rather that they are less capable of successfully carrying out such acts, exemplified in the attack on a Dallas, Texas ICE facility in September of 2025, in which the shooter, attempting to take the lives of ICE agents in seeming protest of the agency and the Trump administration, hit not one ICE agent, but instead hit 3 migrant detainees, killing 2. This would help explain why left-leaning individuals tend to plan more acts of organized violence, but actually commit far fewer than do right-leaning individuals, and significantly fewer than do Islamists. A lack of competence, not a lack of malice. In more recent years, this trend has become more transparent. A study conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a centrist think tank, found that left-wing terrorist plots and attacks have been fairly consistently on the rise since the 1990s in the United States. The researchers categorize attacks motivated by racial or ethnic supremacy, opposition to government authority, misogyny, including incels, hatred based on sexual or gender identity, belief in the QAnon conspiracy theory, opposition to abortion, and partisan extremism against the left as right-wing violence, some of which I separated in my own analysis, and attacks motivated by opposition to capitalism, imperialism or colonialism, black nationalism, support for LGBTQ+ rights, support for environmental causes or animal rights, adherence to pro-communist, pro-socialist beliefs or anti-fascist rhetoric, opposition to government authority under the belief it is a tool of oppression responsible for social injustices, support for decentralized political and social systems, such as anarchism, or partisan extremism against the right as left-wing violence, some of which I also excluded from my analysis. While both left and right-wing terrorist plots and attacks have been increasing since a low point in 2006, with 2 right-wing incidents and 1 left-wing incident that year, as of the time of this study's data collection period, which ended on the 4th of July 2025, 2025 is the first time since the 1990s that completed left-wing violent incidents have exceeded right-wing ones. Jihadist actions, in turn, have been decreasing since a high point of 19 attempted and completed attacks in 2015. These data do not include the assassination of Charlie Kirk, nor attacks on ICE facilities, and as such, at current rates, it is likely that not only will left-wing violence have surpassed that of the right in 2025, as it stands as of the time of this recording, there have been at least 5 times as many terrorist attacks from the left in 2025 than there have been from the right. This likely is due in large part to the second term of President Donald Trump, as the first major spike in left-wing violence since the 90s occurred in 2016, during his first presidential run, but it remained elevated during Biden's presidency, and now has surpassed violence from the right. If the international pattern is consistent, this means the amount of planned violence from the left, given their seemingly lower competency at carrying out violence compared to other groups, must be at a massive peak. As previously mentioned, though, violence is reactionary and reciprocal. When the right commits more violence, the left follows suit, and vice versa. But why do people commit acts of political violence? Well, typically because they feel that something is wrong in society, and the only way to resolve it is through extreme demonstration and harm, to send a message about whatever their grievance is, in blood. One might expect then that when a right-wing leader is in power, there will be less right-wing violence, as they have more perceived representation for their grievances, and conversely, when a left-wing leader is in power, we may reasonably expect less left-wing violence, right? Well, not since 2016 in the US, as violence from the left continued to grow under Biden. While, as previously mentioned, much of this is likely a reaction to the right, who are reacting to the left in a cyclical fashion, we can gain an outside perspective by looking at other national political contexts. Levy, 2025, examined data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project in Colombia between 2005 and 2011 to examine acceptance of state violence based on the ideology of the subject, the ideology of those in power, and the ideology of those being victimized. Colombia was led by conservative President Alvaro Uribe, whose government was in conflict with the Marxist-Leninist paramilitary group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, between the start of data collection in 2005 and 2010, at which point Liberal President Juan Manuel Santos assumed the office and made peace with FARC, which won him the Nobel Peace Prize, unlike some other presidents. Levy found that people responded less negatively to military victimization when they were ideologically aligned with the president of Colombia. Specifically, support for the armed forces and for the national government, following incidents of state violence, declined less when the respondent shared political beliefs with the leader of the country. As such, when the democratically elected leader changes, what type of state-enacted violence is seen as more acceptable also changes. This explains why the left didn't have a problem with state-enforced lockdowns, and why the right doesn't have a problem with labeling Antifa as a terrorist organization, and thereby sanctioning aggressive government action against them. All of the aforementioned discussion of the left-right divide is tied intrinsically to democracy itself, the act of collectively selecting who is in charge of a nation. The relationship between democracy and political violence has long been debated and riddled with seemingly conflicting data, but an analysis from Hand and Saya 2023 provides some solid answers to that question using data also from the Global Terrorism Database. They broke the types of political violence into 2 groups beyond the left-right divide, and instead categorized these incidents as universalist or strategic. The goals of universalist groups are abstract, while those of strategic groups are, well, strategic and achievable. Universalist violence imprecise, while strategic violence tactical, and universalist struggles ideological, while strategic struggles political. The amount of violence and motivations for violence from the Global Terrorism Database were measured against aspects of democracy from Freedom House's Freedom in the World dataset, including political rights and civil liberties broadly, and against aspects from the Varieties of Democracy dataset, including private and political civil liberties. They found that lower levels of civil liberties and political freedoms were associated with a statistically significant increase in universalist terrorism, while conversely, higher levels of civil liberties and political freedoms were associated with statistically significant increases in strategic terrorism. That is, as rights increase, universalist attacks decrease, while strategic attacks increase. Universalist violence tends to be perpetrated by Marxist-Leninists, eco-terrorists, and Islamists, and as such, excluding Islamic terror is largely left-wing. In contrast, strategic violence is driven not by grand ideas, but instead with specific goals in mind, such as liberation, regime overthrow, policy change, social control, or economic concession.
Hey, can you give me some money?
No.
Fascist.
And as such is not inherently left or right wing. But in a roundabout way then, the push for civil liberties and political freedoms, often advocated for by the libertarian right, diminishes the amount of violence committed by the universalist left, while the restriction of civil liberties and political freedoms, oft advocated for by the left, increases the amount of violence committed by the universalist left. That is then, when the left gets the restrictions on liberties and freedoms that they called for during the pandemic, for example, universalist leftist violence increases, explaining the growing incidences of leftist terror under the Biden regime. I need to place a few additional heavy caveats on all of the aforementioned mass data. These are just events that have been recognized and categorized as acts of terror by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism for the Global Terrorism Database and the National Archive of Criminal Justice for the PIRIS database. Inherently, these databases are incapable of being all-encompassing, despite their massive size and scope. There will be a large amount of information that is missing because not all information can possibly be contained within them, and the correlation of these sets requires decisions regarding inclusion criteria, which is why two datasets covering the same subject have vastly different representations of the total number of attacks attributable to left or right over the same time frame. What is interesting, however, is that even with information filtered out by nature of large datasets, the conclusions I have drawn here, by looking at other scholars' analysis and performing my own analysis, which included confirmation of the accuracy of labels and reorganizing data a variety of ways, in my best attempt to reflect accurately what could be described as left or right-wing groups and motivations for violence are this. The left is at least as violent as the right, if not more so. The difference in the apparent overrepresentation of right-wing violence, in turn, is a product, seemingly, of competence. That is, leftist groups have greater intention towards enacting violence, but are unable or unwilling to enact it to the same degree as their right-wing counterparts. Were they equally competent, they would be equally violent, if not more so. Hence why, as the political temperature has risen and attempts increased, completed attacks have now also surpassed that of the right as of 2025. For that to be the case, and based on longitudinal data, the number of planned attacks on the left have likely increased to a significant degree, as previously mentioned. Given that leftist attacks that are actually carried out are 5.3% less likely to result in injury and 21% less likely to result in death, and taking into consideration that uncovered leftist plots are 0.5% more common than right-wing ones, we are looking at a hypothetical increase in left-wing plots of violence for these real-world outcomes to be succinct with previous data in order to surpass that of the right in 2025 of, at a minimum, 12 to 77%. But these are, again, the lowest end estimates for these figures. An average of 44.5% more thoughts and plans to enact violence on the political left to just reach parity with the right. In reality, given the amount of information inherently missing from these datasets, the true amount of planned violence is likely far in excess of 44.5% just to match the right. The left has, however, surpassed it, meaning that, based on these estimates, the left likely plans significantly above 44.5% more violence than does the right as of 2025 in the United States. That is the base estimate, 44.5%. So, now that I have evidenced that violence is not exclusively a left or right-wing phenomenon, and that the difference in actual completed attacks that result in death and injury seem to be due to a lack of competence rather than a lack of intent, let's look more into the ugliness not just of action, but of the intent that drives that action, as well as the kind of language that underpins violent acts. In the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, what perhaps shocked people most was, after all, not an escalation of physical violence, although that also occurred, but an escalation of vitriol, largely on social media, but also even on mainstream television, with celebrities and random posters alike apparently unable to prevent themselves from celebrating a man's brutal murder, and in doing so, signaling their in-group associations with the left as oppositional to the right, represented in the form of Mr. Kirk, and in that aftermath, also in the form of his widow, who they relentlessly mocked during her time of mourning. While these acts and words were often excused by drawing comparisons to the tragic killing of Melissa Hortman and her husband by a Tim Walz appointee turned Trump voter, thousands of videos cheering on their killer were not similarly posted online as they were for the murder of Charlie Kirk. And while many on the right mocked what appeared to be a sexual tryst gone wrong that resulted in an attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband Paul by a mentally ill drug addict, Paul Pelosi is alive. The same cannot be said about Charlie Kirk. These ugly internet interactions raise another pertinent question. Is the left not only more violent in their planning, if less successful in carrying out that violence, but also more cruel and vicious in their words and thoughts? Well, if one were to believe an analysis of ideological asymmetry in hateful speech used on Twitter from Badanadol 2023, they would come to the conclusion that actually, the left is more civil than the right online. Although, as we will see, not only is that not entirely accurate, but actually, the results are far more condemnatory towards the left than they are towards the right, as it concerns political civility online. The authors use machine learning techniques to assess messages sent by users determined to be left or right wing based on major accounts, followed by individual users. This method is certainly fallible. However, it is a relatively valid manner, as determined via multiple analyses using this method, of determining a Twitter user's political alignments, as people who lean to the right tend to follow major conservative accounts more than they do major leftist accounts, and vice versa, with the exception of hate following and attempts to, essentially, spy on the enemy. After classifying accounts as more conservative or more liberal based on the other accounts in their network, 7,000 tweets were coded by human raters for their levels of prejudice, name-calling, threats, use of stereotypes, obscenity, and hatred as training data to further analyze over 80,000 tweets from more than 300,000 users. Using this method, they found that conservatives were more likely to express negative prejudice towards political outgroups, engage in name-calling, and for their messages to include threats, stereotypes, and hatred, while liberals tended to use more obscenity. These effects were small, but statistically significant. Right-leaning accounts were also very slightly more likely to use threats, name-calling, stereotypes, and express negative prejudice towards other right-wing groups or people, while left-leaning accounts were more likely to use hatred and obscenity towards conservatives. It appears then that conservatives are the ones who are more hateful and cruel online. While the left also expresses hatred toward conservatives, the relationship was weaker than the hatred expressed from the right toward the left. And while there was no relationship between ideology and obscenity towards left-wing targets, left-wing accounts used more obscenity towards right-wing targets. Except, here's the problem with this paper published in Nature, one of the most esteemed and renowned publications in academia. They sampled very few accounts, more than 2 standard deviations to the left of the mean, while they sampled many accounts up to 4 standard deviations right of the mean. Scores range from negative 2.61 standard deviations for the most left-leaning accounts to positive 4.67 standard deviations for the most right-leaning accounts. That is, this was the result by looking at messages from people often, in a sense, twice as conservative as the most liberal accounts in the entire dataset. Further, more than 229,000 tweets, 70.5% of the sample that referred to a political group, referenced left-leaning groups or people, while far fewer, just under 96,000 posts, referred to right-leaning groups or people specifically. To make matters worse, of the humans who coded the training data, 8 of the 11 raters leaned to the left. While the authors report that this didn't affect their ability to detect hate, liberals tended to be overly sensitive to name-calling, while the 3 non-liberal coders tended to be overly sensitive to obscenity. The problem with this, however, is that these largely left-leaning human coders were then handed a sample of posts that overwhelmingly came from conservative accounts talking about left-wing people and groups. The conservatives they sampled were also more staunchly conservative than were the posts from left-wing accounts, none of whom veered further than the center-left. To put it another way, in order to find the result that right-leaning accounts were very slightly more likely to be hateful than were left-leaning accounts, the authors had to oversample conservative posts by 2.4 times relative to the number of posts from liberal accounts, from a sample that contained mostly center-leftists, and trained by coders who were largely left-leaning themselves. There were too few data from users more than 2 standard deviations from the mean to the left for me to even create a hypothetical model off of this dataset to represent how much hatred, obscenity, name-calling, etc. that far left-wing accounts engage in. But given the incredibly small effects reported from this study with such skewed data, this paper published in Nature actually evidences that center-leftists are only very slightly less vicious and hateful than our right-wing partisans. And I don't say that without further rationale, either, as an analysis of online discussions revolving around the US Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, which was assessed by Rao et al. 2025, found that while conservatives expressed more anger, rudeness, and hate in total compared to liberals, who used more obscenity and insults, these were patterns of speech reacting to one another.
Yeah, it's like poetry, sort of they rhyme.
Such that when liberals were insulting, conservatives responded more angrily, for example. And even these interactions were further influenced by outside factors. As while liberal posts expressed more positive emotions after Biden signed an EO for out-of-state abortion access, conservatives used more hateful language after the midterms and the breaking of a news story during the same time frame regarding a 10-year-old girl seeking abortion in Indianapolis after having been sexually assaulted by an illegal immigrant. It also appears in these data that conservatives and liberals were, in essence, having 2 completely different conversations regarding the topic of Roe v. Wade, perhaps explaining why there was so much anger surrounding the issue. Of course, it's also just possible that millennial woe's axiom that the left likes to pretend to not understand things, specifically to make discourse impossible, is also the cause. Specifically, conservatives tended to talk about fetal rights and religion, while liberals tended to talk more about special case exceptions, such as assault, as well as women's bodily autonomy and health. Liberals became significantly angrier in response to tweets mentioning religion than did conservatives, representing the second highest rating of anger, while the post that provoked the most anger was discussion of exceptions to abortion law, posted by liberals, although that particular topic also angered conservatives the most as well. Everyone seems to get very frustrated when talking about the small fraction of abortions in the United States in which the pregnancy was the result of a sexual assault or incest. Either because it is such a small percentage, because the notion is just so disconcerting, or a combination of both. In total, looking at the means for all items, conservatives were more hateful than were liberals, but liberals were more rude, obscene, insulting, and angry overall. It also appears that, in addition to left-wing violence increasing over time, interest in far left-leaning politics, specifically of the tanky variety, have been increasing in online spaces such as Reddit, as seen in an assessment from Balka, Sirivianos, and Blackburn, 2023. What exactly is a tanky? Well, the definition the authors used from Christina Pettersson is that tankies, quote, regard the past and current socialist systems as legitimate attempts at creating communism, and thus have not distanced themselves from Stalin, China, etc. After searching Reddit for the term tanky and finding r/inform tanky, the authors found 5 additional tanky subreddits listed officially as its allies. The largest, and since quarantined, are Gen Zedong, an admittedly clever pun, as well as r/genzhao, r/send in the tanks, r/ask tankies, and r/bunkertube, the latter of which barely has any posts on it, making it largely irrelevant to this analysis. The authors then compared activity on these tanky subreddits to 43 different subreddits representing a range of ideologies, from r-conservative to r-anarchism, including other large communist and far left-leaning subreddits. They found that tanky subreddits experienced a notable growth in monthly active users since July of 2020, surpassing other far left-leaning subreddits in user activity from April of 2021 and onwards. These tanky communities tended to discuss violence more, specifically in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and the Uyghur genocide, or, as they preferred to call it, Uyghur boarding schools, while paying less attention to social issues such as police brutality, climate change, healthcare, unionizing, taxation, firearms, and landlords.
We love landlords, we love them a lot. We're all against unions, they're not fair to the corporate companies.
There were also lexical differences between the rest of the left and the tanky subset, as they tended to use the term CPC, Communist Party of China, rather than CCP, Chinese Communist Party, referred to Uyghur camps, again, as boarding schools, rioters as protesters, Israel and Israelis as Zionist, and use a variety of insulting names for other left-leaning political groups, such as libshit for liberal and suckdem for social democrats. Tanky subreddits use toxic language more than 7 times the rate of the total Reddit sample, but severely toxic language at 47.5 times the rate as the rest of Reddit. The subjects of their toxicity were the subreddit Stupid Idpol most commonly, a community of Marxists who oppose identity politics, followed by whites, described often as Mayos, and then Nicolae Ceausescu, the last communist leader of Romania. The targets of the most severe toxicity were most commonly fascists, followed by Americans, often referred to as Yankees, and then the Stupid Idpol community once again, indicating that the targets of hate from the far left are not just the right, but even more commonly, just those slightly less far left than themselves. Further, tankies were 100 times more likely to make threats, 50 times more likely to attack the identity of others, 21.2 times more likely to insult others, and 5.3 times more profane than the rest of Reddit. Thus, these far-left subreddits, focused more on war and violence and less on social issues, who disparage other left-wing groups, are vastly more likely to use toxic language, make threats, and insult others. In other words, the kinds of communities that would likely appeal to viewers of someone like Hassan Piker have been growing since 2021, while participation in other, less toxic left-wing subreddits has simultaneously declined. This type of rhetoric is increasingly becoming the majority and the norm on the left side of the political aisle. Another social media site that has raised concern regarding being a political and ideological echo chamber is TikTok, which is probably why the Israelis bought it from China, and was certainly the place where some of the most vile posts regarding Charlie Kirk were made. Andreeva et al. 2025 used coders to assess the content of nearly 200 TikToks posted by English-language accounts, with over 1,000 followers, labeled as extreme right-wing by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and building their own sample of extreme left-wing accounts, using a snowball method based on searches for anarchism, communism, Marx, and Lenin, as no such list had curiously previously been collated. They found that while direct calls to physical harm to others were relatively rare, they were also evenly distributed between left and right-wing extremists, while far-left accounts posted more than twice as many videos with a call to action. For example, small-scale rioting and looting, or just going outside, albeit going outside Ted Kaczynski style. The types of moral appeals made in these TikToks aligned mostly along the differences found between liberals and conservatives, identified by Graham Hite and Nozick's 2009 Moral Foundations theory. In that far-right accounts appealed most frequently to in-group loyalty, followed by authority, but also care, and least frequently to purity, despite purity being a moral foundation typically held far more commonly by the right. In contrast, far-left accounts appealed most frequently to fairness, followed by care, and then in-group loyalty. Looking specifically at authority, while classically attributed as a right-wing moral foundation, it was also present in 14% of left-leaning TikToks. More than twice as many, 31%, of far-right TikToks made an appeal to authority, but this finding is indicative that amongst more extreme political messaging, appealing to authority may be less exclusive to the right than is previously hypothesized, and as a growing body of literature has begun to evidence in research on left-wing authoritarianism. As the moral foundations of liberals and conservatives are different, we should also expect their application of moral principles to be different, which was assessed in a series of studies from Ullman et al. 2023. In their first, participants were given a modified version of the trolley problem, asking them if they would push a large man, given either a stereotypically white name, Chip Ellsworth III,
Are these rumors true that you're descended from the British nobility?
I'm descended from all them cocksuckers.
or a stereotypically black name, Tyrone Payton.
Hello, my name is Jamal. Every 60 seconds in Africa, a minute passes.
In front of an out-of-control train, speeding towards either the New York Philharmonic Orchestra or the Harlem Jazz Orchestra, which just so happened to be performing in the middle of the train tracks at the time, in order to prevent the train from harming either group. Conservatives were more likely to push Tyrone in front of the train, while liberals were more likely to push Chip, regardless of which orchestra the act was saving. Given that scenario involved saving both a group, more likely to be either white or black, by sacrificing the life of a likely either white or black man, and thereby contains a lot of racial arithmetic.
Stupid.
They're not.
What's 9 plus 10?
21.
You stupid.
Their second study used a less complicated moral scenario, a modified lifeboat dilemma. Participants at Cornell University were asked to imagine that they were on an overcrowded lifeboat with a severely injured man. Once again, either Tyrone or Chip, who would not be able to survive until the passengers were rescued, and chose whether or not to throw the man overboard to prevent the entire raft from sinking. This time, liberals again elected to push Chip into the water to save the lives of everyone on board, while conservatives gave no preference to Chip over Tyrone, but were more likely to choose the consequentialist option in order to save the lives of others and themselves, unbiased by the race of the injured man. Thus, across two scenarios, liberals preferred to save or not sacrifice a likely non-white person, both to save themselves and others, while conservatives were only more likely to sacrifice a black person if his death would save the lives of others, not their own lives and those of others, simultaneous. When conservatives' own lives were at risk, they did not discriminate based on race, while liberals did racially discriminate against whites whether or not their own lives were on the line. In order to double-check if the results of the first experiments were due to readers rechecking the likely races of the involved parties based on their names, in a second study, the authors again presented subjects with a trolley problem, but this time on a separate page as the questions concerning it, with instructions not to return and reread the previous pages, allowing for more natural intuitions to come forward. Participants also read both versions of the scenario and responded to them separately. This time, the same results as a lifeboat prompt were present. Liberals were less likely to use consequentialist moral reasoning when the man's name was Tyrone than when his name was Chip, while conservatives showed no preference based on perceived race of the man in the lifeboat. Once again then, liberals discriminated based on race, and conservatives did not. It is also worth noting that the student population of UC Irvine, where the first experiment was conducted, is only 15% white, while the student population of Cornell is 30% white as of 2024 through 2025 data. But the consistent finding that conservatives are generally less likely to say they would be willing to harm another based on their race held up in both samples, just as did the consistent findings that liberals are more likely to harm a white person and less likely to harm a black person, both to save themselves and to save the lives of others. Study 4, which is the last of interest for us in this long set, provided participants at UC Irvine with two scenarios wherein military leaders in Iraq had engaged in a strategic action intended to mitigate future casualties, but had unintentionally cost the lives of civilians.
Like Soink Scoop, those civilians were unarmed. Scoop, this is no laughing matter. You just committed a severe war crime.
Half of the participants read that the Americans had instigated the attack first, and the other half that the Iraqis had. Conservative students indicated that the action of the military leader was more morally acceptable when the victims of the attack were Iraqi, while liberals were not more nor less likely to endorse consequentialism in either scenario, indicating that liberals do not have an ethical preference for their shared in-group, Americans, compared to an out-group with which the in-group was in conflict, Iraqis. That is, American conservatives placed a higher value on the lives of their fellow countrymen over those of foreigners in warfare, while liberals do not. As such, conservatives may be more likely to justify the use of violence when it saves American lives, while liberals may not.
Protect homeless veterans or protect illegal immigrants?
Illegal.
This trend did not largely apply to the case of Irina Zarutska, however, a Ukrainian immigrant woman murdered by an African-American recidivist and serial felon. Despite Irina being an immigrant and her killer an American, conservatives were outraged by the event, while it seemed of little comparative concern to those on the left, for whom the life of Irina is, seemingly consistently with the results of Ullman et al. Study, worth less than the life of the man who killed her, because of the colors of their skin. The same could be said for the contrast between the reactions to the death of fellow recidivist and serial felon, George Floyd, and the outrage his death sparked versus the hundreds of thousands of posts, TikToks, and public performances ranging from nonchalance to outright celebration and jubilation, expressed by the left following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. The value of a person's life for the left, demonstrably, is driven by race, while the same is not the case for those on the right, both in practice and in laboratory settings. Violence and aggression are often seen as last resorts when civil dialogue, the entire point of Charlie Kirk's work, has failed, when all that is left is anger, vitriol, and hatred. As such, it is possible that some degree of political aggression derives from feelings of having no legal recourse to redress one's societal concerns, as previously described, and which was assessed in an analysis of vocalized support for political violence amongst self-described proponents of various European political parties and non-voters in 18 European countries, conducted by Matsunaga 2025, using data from the European Values Survey. Compared to moderates and non-voters, respondents who supported either a right or left-wing populist party were more likely to report justifications for political violence, although the effect was stronger for right-wing populists. In turn, supporting a center-right party was negatively related to justifications for political violence, while supporting a center-left party was unrelated to justifications for violence. But why? Well, Matsunaga found that there was an important variable that influenced these trends, whether or not a right-wing populist party held seats in a nation's government. Specifically, in Hungary and Poland, both of which have right-wing populist representation in government, were much more negative amongst right-wing populists than in countries without populist right representation. Given being center-right was the only political orientation negatively related to vocalizing justifications for violence, the broad-level elevation in support for violence amongst those who identify with right-wing populists is significantly affected by whether or not the populist right feels, essentially, politically helpless. Further, when examining the socio-economic factors that predicted support for a populist party, the increased acceptance of political violence in both left and right-wing populists becomes more clear. Specifically, being younger, male, and unemployed increased the likelihood that an individual would support either a left or right-wing populist party across European countries. One factor that predicted support for populism amongst those on the right, however, was being an immigrant. Looking more closely, we can see that right-wing populists who are higher in national pride are less likely to vocalize support for violence as a tactic, while conversely, being more educated was associated with an increase in support for violent tactics amongst left-wing populists, seemingly affected by postgraduate educational attainment being a predictive factor in support for left-wing populism. Although supporting center-left parties was unrelated to support for violence, having national pride was a predictor of it amongst center-leftists, while not having national pride predicted support for violence in left-wing populists, and being an immigrant was not a predictor of support for left-wing populism as it was for right-wing populism. For center-right individuals, however, again, the only group with which membership represented a negative relationship with support for violence, specifically being opposed to immigration, was negatively related to support for violence, as was xenophobia, which helps provide more clarity regarding the role being an immigrant and attitudes towards immigration play in support for right-wing populism over center-right parties, which is that, it seems, not having national pride, supporting immigration, and not being xenophobic are predictors of justifying violence on the populist and center-right. In other words, the most peaceful people in European politics are center-right citizens of a nation who are proud of their nation, opposed to immigration, and are xenophobic.
Ooh, I hate what I see right now. Someone who looks different from me driving a nicer car than I do. You know what I drive every day? A Chevy Malibu. You think that's cool? You think that's a cool car? You like Chevy Malibu?
They're kind of nice. Well, no, I don't.
Well, I should also note that this study sampled 2.4 times as many right-wing populists as it did left-wing populists, meaning that there is an inherent skew due to oversampling. The underlying data themselves are still telling. People in democratic systems whose preferred party is represented in government are less likely to vocalize their justifications for violence compared to those who feel unrepresented, both on the left and on the right. Other forms of disenfranchisement, namely being a young, unemployed man, in societies which have built complex structures designed to disenfranchise them in the name of equity, similarly increases support for both lanes of populism. For right-wing populism, and only right-wing populism, being an immigrant predicted that support, again indicating that feelings of disenfranchisement drive support for both forms of populism. But particularly amongst immigrants, they tend to see the right as being better suited to address their concerns, seemingly rather ironically. Perhaps it is not ironic, but rather instead that young men who are angry, unemployed, and immigrants are more likely to use populism as a means of taking out their resentment. One reason then, in addition to competence, for which we see fewer death and injury resulting from left-wing terrorism historically, is because they have rarely lacked any form of governmental representation, while the populist right largely seems to feel as if it has, at least until recently. Hence why in countries where the populist right has power, namely Poland and Hungary, support for violence across the board is lower. While populist movements tend to focus on the personal plights of the common man, the political is not personal for all people. And classic social science research regarding social identity theory, Tajfel et al. 1979, has tended to keep the two aspects of the self separate: core identity and political identity. However, identity fusion theory, Swan et al. 2009, describes a condition wherein the individual self and their group identity become united as a single, cohesive sense of self, generating increased perceived agency and feelings of invulnerability, the self being enmeshed and fused into the group so that both group and personal identity are active simultaneously, both me and we at the same time. Interestingly, identity fusion does not require membership within the fused group for that fused identity to inspire action and even violence in the name of a group to which one does not actually belong. As, for example, Kuntz et al. 2018 found that when white American students reported a fused identity with Palestinians or Kurds, they were more likely to report willingness to engage in violent protest for Palestinian or Kurdish causes, despite the fact that they themselves had no personal stake in the Israeli-Palestine nor Kurdish-Turkish conflicts. This fusion with an outgroup identity was related to identifying as an activist and as a leftist, as well as to feelings of anger and of self-efficacy, the belief that one is capable of enacting change. Waits et al. 2014, rather famously and now mimetically, demonstrated the outgroup preference that people who lean to the left tend to have. And although again mimetic, their research is far from alone in demonstrating this tendency. Those on the left consistently prefer outgroups over in-groups, foreigners over countrymen. A meta-analysis of 90 published studies and unpublished manuscripts on identity fusion from Varman et al. 2024 examined the relationship between identity fusion and reported willingness to fight, die, or sacrifice oneself for the cause of the group, engage in extreme collective action, and outgroup hostility. There were 6 group types assessed: religion, country, kinship, politics, outgroups, and other groups. They found that identity fusion with outgroups, groups to which one is not a member, produced the strongest effects on these variables, relative to fusion with a political group, with kin, or with countrymen. The strongest effect of fusion was on extreme collective action, followed by willingness to fight, die, or sacrifice for the cause, and then by outgroup hostility. That is then, people who experience identity fusion with outgroups, groups they themselves are not members of, are more likely to report willingness to engage in collective action, to fight, die, or sacrifice for the outgroup, and are more hostile towards other outgroups compared to those who experience identity fusion with their political allies, their social network, or those of their same nationality. People who lean to the left, and in particular, those who are leftist activists, tend to have outgroup preferences, demonstrated again in their tendency for identity fusion with groups to which they are not members, for example, Palestinians and Kurds. And 90 studies confirm that people with a fused identity with outgroups are more politically extremist in their behavioral intent. The Waits analysis heat map is perhaps the most intentionally misunderstood piece of scientific data passed around in modern politics. Those on the left often claim that their revealed outgroup preference, evidenced by the heat map, actually just means that they love everyone and everything. Due to this insistence, accompanied by a universal refusal to actually read Waits et al.'s series of studies, as it was not just one study, I have demonstrated here in a separate study the same effects present in the Waits heat map. The left not only has a preference for those dissimilar to themselves, they are also willing to die and potentially even kill over this outgroup preference. This also perhaps explains why immigrants seem to be some of the most extreme members of the populist right. Their personal identity as an immigrant is fused with the outgroup identity of the nation to which they have immigrated, or wish to immigrate. For the same reason, leftists who have a fused identity with groups to which they are not members, be it of race, nationality, immigrant status, socioeconomic status, etc., report greater intent to engage in extreme political action, including a willingness to sacrifice their own lives for the cause of the fused out group. When the left tells you they hate groups to which they are a member, be it Americans, whites, cisgender people, and so on, that hatred comes with a willingness to fight and die to defend groups to which they do not belong.
How could this have happened? A black white supremacist.
Obviously, partisans are biased, but all of the aforementioned information need be weighed against the fact that they are biased symmetrically, both on the left and the right, as evidenced in a meta-analysis of 41 studies from Ditto et al. 2019. That is, people who are leftist partisans are more or less exactly as biased as people who are rightist partisans. But it wasn't political partisanship that was strongly correlated with intentions to engage in extreme political action in Varman et al.'s meta-analysis. It was outgroup identity fusion, and typically, the left is the side of the political aisle that experiences mass outgroup identity fusion, typically white, middle or upper middle class, citizens who are willing to lay down their lives for non-white, impoverished immigrants. Just as both partisan sides are equally biased, both partisan sides are also equally intolerant of one another, as illustrated in a review of literature on the ideological conflict hypothesis from Brandt et al. 2014. Concerning willingness to discriminate, self-professed conservatives were more discriminatory in general compared to liberals, both towards conservative groups and towards liberal groups, but liberals were far less willing to discriminate against liberal groups than conservatives were to discriminate against their own. Despite being unwilling to discriminate against politically aligned groups, liberals also expressed significantly higher levels of disliking other liberal groups than did conservatives towards other conservative groups. Once again, illustrating that the left almost never punches left, even if they dislike other leftist groups. Thus, it appears that while both sides are equally biased and equally intolerant of the other, left-leaning individuals both tend to dislike and even hate other leftist groups, while being less willing to discriminate against them, seemingly being more utilitarian-minded as it concerns political goals than is the right, as while conservatives also dislike other conservatives, they are also far more willing to discriminate against their own, perfectly exemplified in the case of a leaked group chat of members of the Young Republicans making edgy jokes in private and being instantly denounced by many prominent figures on the right.
But it has led to, I think, a reactionary response on some parts of the right to say there should be no policing ever at all. No social consequences should ever attend to things that are said on the right.
All while the left refused to condemn Jay Jones for calling for the murder of children of Republicans in the same week and then elected him to office. We have looked at actions, we have looked at words and thoughts. So now, let us turn our attention even deeper to what drives words and thoughts: morality and ethics. Are the moral frameworks of people who tend to identify with different political orientations fundamentally distinct? And if so, how do these moral frameworks affect subsequent thoughts, words, and ultimately, actions? Both broad political orientations left and right, can be authoritarian in nature. But the left is often uniquely utilitarian in its moral reasoning. To better understand justifications for violence, left-wing authoritarianism, and the role that utilitarian reasoning plays in these justifications, we can look to a study of Polish participants from Zamotel Piotrowska et al. 2025, along with support for unrestricted war tactics, those that would violate the Geneva Convention, as a means to an end. Unrestricted tactics are not aimed at minimizing human suffering, nor in targeting only military forces, rather than civilians. While right-wing authoritarianism was unrelated to support for either restricted or unrestricted tactics in warfare, left-wing authoritarianism was negatively correlated to support for restricted means and positively correlated with support of unrestricted warfare tactics. Left-wing authoritarianism, LWA, was largely unrelated to right-wing authoritarianism, indicating that this still relatively new concept, and it is relatively new as it was only formally identified in 2020, is distinct from the instrument used to measure right-wing authoritarianism, which is really just a revised version of Theodor Adorno's fascism scale. My scientific concerns with the right-wing authoritarianism instrument aside, specifically, the relationship between LWA and support for unrestricted means in warfare was limited to the LWA subscale of anti-hierarchical aggression, which is measured in affirmative responses to questions such as, quote, old-fashioned ways and values must be abolished, and, quote, rich people should be forced to give up virtually all of their wealth, end quote. In essence, for left-wing authoritarians, as they have few qualms about saying, there are no bad tactics, only bad targets.
If you are a Republican on TikTok and you want to interact with me, you deserve to die. You deserve to be shot. You deserve whatever suffering could possibly come to you. If you are a Republican and try to start any of that kind of nonsense with me in person, you will lose your life. This is war. I am not joking.
As the LWA instrument is still novel, it has not been tested directly against utilitarianism. However, right-wing authoritarianism, RWA, as measured in relationship to utilitarianism by Boyston, Rhodes, and Heel 2016, found a preference for utilitarian options over deontological options across 3 studies for those higher in right-wing authoritarianism. Despite Zamotel Piotrowska et al. Not finding any relationship between left and right-wing authoritarianism, the two concepts do overlap in their tendency for dogmatism, punitive attitudes towards dissenters, and desire for strong authority figures, as seen in an analysis of the two instruments and COVID-19 policy preferences from Manson 2020, who found that the two types of authoritarians both agree fairly consistently and to similar degrees on topics such as restricting rights to protest and trial by jury, as well as in willingness to report non-compliance to the police. The relationship between utilitarian moral reasoning, obsessive passion, and ideologically motivated violence was studied by Snook et al. 2025, who surveyed American supporters of the Democrat and Republican parties, U.S. Democrat Party members, and a sample of Kazakhstani Police Academy cadets, for no real reason other than because several of the co-authors are from Kazakhstan.
Love from Kazakhstan. I hate women so much it's unreal.
And found that commitment to a cause, measured with questions such as, quote, I am passionate about the party, harmonious passion, measured with questions such as, quote, my involvement in the party reflects the qualities I like about myself, and particularly obsessive passion, measured with questions such as, quote, the party is the only thing I can think of, were related to intentions to engage in both peaceful and violent activism, including willingness to break the law, harass others, destroy property, and physically assault others. Obsessive passion specifically was more strongly correlated with violent activism than it was peaceful activism. Similarly, utilitarianism was correlated with both types of activism, but more strongly to intentions to engage in violent activism. Combined, obsessive passion and utilitarian moral reasoning strongly predicted violent intent. As such, a belief that the perceived good of the many is more important than the needs of the few or the one, in practice, is associated with increased intent to enact violence to secure that perceived good.
Peace is good, but how much are you willing to pay for it? Whatever it costs. That's the kind of irresponsible spending that causes so many business ventures to fail. You're forgetting the third rule. Right now, peace could be bought at a bargain price, and you don't even realize it.
One factor that inevitably becomes the subject of discussion following any sort of violent political event is the mental health of the perpetrator. So, what is the role that certain traits and mental disorders play in the interaction between morality and mental health that may influence an individual's decision to harm others for the greater good of society? A study of one of the most well-known utilitarian thought experiments, the aforementioned trolley problem, wherein one must choose to sacrifice the life of one person to save the lives of several people, from Kahane et al. 2015, revealed, however, that preference for the utilitarian option of action was unrelated to actual revealed preference for the greater good. In their first study, US participants who chose to sacrifice one person so that 5 others would live in response to the trolley problem reported lower ratings of wrongness of the utilitarian option, predictably. However, selecting the utilitarian option was related to primary psychopathy, measured with questions such as, quote, I tell people what they want to hear so that they will do what I tell them to do, as well as to reduced empathetic concern, measured with questions such as, quote, when I see someone being taken advantage of, I feel kind of protective towards them. Further, 10% of the variance in the perceived wrongness of sacrificing the one for the many was predicted entirely by primary psychopathy. As such, despite their refrains of possessing limitless empathy,
I just can't help myself but feel for other people's pain and suffering now.
Leftists who utilize utilitarian moral reasoning are not only less empathetic, they are more likely to have symptoms of psychopathy.
What are we doing? What are we saying? He needs a hug? No, he doesn't need a hug. He needs a good ass whooping is what he needs.
In a second study, US participants who reported that they identified with all of humanity rather than with a specific group were lower in primary psychopathy, but were higher in all measured forms of egoism: psychological, rational, and ethical. These 3 forms of egoism were measured with the following questions. Quote, people may sometimes appear to do things for the sake of others, but deep down, the only thing that really motivates people is their own self-interest. Psychological egoism. Quote, an action isn't rational if it doesn't aim to promote one's own self-interest. Rational egoism. And quote, an action isn't morally right if it doesn't aim to promote one's own self-interest. Ethical egoism. Utilitarian judgments were associated with only one type of egoism: rational egoism. Further, the relationship between identification with all of humanity and utilitarian choices was mediated by primary psychopathy, meaning that identifying with all of the human species was only related to preferring utilitarian moral reasoning when the individual also possessed psychopathic traits. In other words, if someone tells you that they care about all of humanity, rather than having a moral preference for those of their same nationality, for example, and also utilize utilitarian, for the greater good moral reasoning, they are more likely, at least somewhat, to be psychopathic. Finding the utilitarian option to be less morally wrong was related to primary psychopathy, rational egoism, and ethical egoism, but was not related to identification with all of humanity. When asked if they would actually perform the utilitarian action, sacrificing the few for the many, primary psychopathy was related to a greater likelihood of intent, while identification with all humanity was negatively related to intent. As such, identification with all humanity, which, as demonstrated now quite famously and mimetically by Waits et al. 2014, tends to align with left-wing moral circles, but which has also been found to be negatively related to right-wing authoritarianism by Hemmer, McFarland, and Penske 2019, does not preclude preference for utilitarian thinking. However, the two are related when an individual is high in primary psychopathy. For these people, morality is defined as whatever actions they can justify without punishment. Calling for the deaths of your enemies.
You need to be showing your opponent's guts on there, okay? You need to be gutting them. You need to be shanking these and letting their intestines just ride on stage. What the is this shit, man? Slice them up. Slice them and dice them.
For the streets to soak with their red capitalist blood.
Yeah, kill them. Kill those and murder those in the street. Let the streets soak in their red capitalist bloods, dude.
Demanding that if your fans really cared, they would kill politicians.
If you cared about Medicare fraud or Medicaid fraud, you would kill Rick Scott.
And animal abuse
If you run right now, I'll f***ing kill you. Like, I'll actually kill you, okay? In front of everyone.
are all only immoral if you get in trouble for doing or saying it. This second study from Kahane et al. Also presented subjects with 3 self-beneficial and 3 other beneficial scenarios, and subjects were asked how likely they would be to actually perform these scenarios in real life. An example of an other beneficial scenario is a modified version of the trolley problem. A runaway trolley is careening down the tracks towards a group of 5 workmen. Beside you is an extremely large lad. Do you push this absolute unit in front of the trolley, physically stopping it via the sheer mass of his girth, or watch helplessly as the 5 workmen are killed? An example of a self-beneficial scenario is the crying baby problem. Enemy soldiers have captured your village and have been ordered to kill every human being over the age of 2. You, your baby, and a group of villagers have hidden in a cellar from the onslaught when the baby starts crying, struggling to breathe. Do you allow your baby to cry, alerting the guards and leading to your own death and the deaths of your fellow villagers? Or do you smother your own child to death to save your own life and those of the townsfolk? Selecting the utilitarian option in both the self-beneficial and other beneficial case, that is, choosing to throw the fat guy in front of the train and choosing to suffocate the baby to save yourself and others, were significantly correlated with primary psychopathy. Further, people who strongly identified with all of humanity were more likely to say that they would actually perform the self-beneficial utilitarian action, but not the other beneficial one, meaning that people who believe that they care about all people are more likely to say that they would suffocate their own baby to save themselves and others than to end one person's life to save only the lives of others. As I don't think that particular example would surprise anyone, given the attitudes many people on the left express towards unborn children, using another of the self-beneficial scenarios given here, this means that people who claim to care about all of humanity, rather than just some of humanity, would elect to use the body of an injured person crawling through an open window to escape a burning building as a battering ram to make room for themselves and others, rather than allow the injured person to crawl to safety while sacrificing themselves in the process.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
The second study's subjects were also asked what portion of a bonus check they would be willing to donate to a charity for people in the third world, knowing that their donation would be matched by a company, effectively doubling it, from $0 to $100. People high in psychopathy promised to donate less to a foreign charity, while people high in identification with all humanity promised to donate more. As we should expect, but those who selected utilitarian moral judgments in these experiments were less likely to donate, once again indicating the relationship between identification with all humanity, utilitarian moral reasoning, and psychopathy, all explaining actual intent to engage in charitable action for outgroups. The people whose morality falls in the distant concentric rings of the Waits et al. Heat map will not actually donate their money to a foreign charity when they prefer utilitarian moral reasoning, and when they have primary psychopathic traits. They may say they will, but they will not actually commit funds to charity when given the option. To further understand how these theoretical questions relate to the real world, in a third study, in addition to the aforementioned questions, American participants were asked to what extent they agreed or disagreed with a series of realistic utilitarian actions, such as, quote, well-off people in the West have moral obligations to help poor people in developing countries, as well as how acceptable they rated several behaviors: animal experimentation, abortion, meat eating, and torture under a variety of circumstances. Individuals higher in psychopathy were more accepting of causing real-world harm, yet were less utilitarian concerning real-life issues. That is, they were accepting of things like abortion, but did not believe in actually sacrificing, say, their own wealth for the good of the many in practice. In Kahane et al.'s fourth and final study, American subjects were given several additional greater good moral choices. For example, donating to a charity that would save life in one's own country versus donating to a charity that would save a greater number of people in a foreign country, and were given an extra $1 on top of the 50 cents they had already received for participation that they could choose to actually donate any amount of to a charity focused on eliminating disease and poverty in the third world. Psychopathy was related to decreased wrongness perceptions of utilitarian options for personal dilemmas, but not with making actual utilitarian judgments for the greater good. People who were more utilitarian in personal dilemmas were not more likely to be truly utilitarian in their behavioral intent, and vice versa. The amount of money actually donated to charity was unrelated to psychopathy, greater good judgments, and utilitarian moral reasoning, meaning that when push comes to shove, and given essentially money for nothing to donate to those on the other side of the world at no personal cost, neither those who say they value the greater good, the good of the many, nor those who say they would sacrifice one person to save the lives of 5 others, actually chose to share their wealth. Not even a few extra cents when given the chance. Subjects who rated higher on psychopathy felt less morally obligated to sacrifice themselves for others, while also being less likely to put those close to them, family, friends, and nation, before the greater good. Those high in psychopathy, therefore, are not willing to sacrifice their own money or selves for the good of the many, but are willing to sacrifice their friends and family for the good of the many. Additionally, it seems that people who profess preference for utilitarian moral reasoning are unwilling to actually enact utilitarian behaviors, but are more likely to do so when they themselves would be personally affected. This is performative altruism and a luxury belief. To fully complete this model of left-wing morality, we can look to a study from Crispin's and Bertram's 2023, who examined the relationship between left-wing authoritarianism, commitment to social justice, altruism, and the dark triad personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. In their first study, in a sample of college students at the University of Bern, Switzerland, Crispin's and Bertram's found that those high in left-wing authoritarianism tended to have high levels of specifically neurotic narcissism, which is a preoccupation with what others think, and includes high levels of shame and a strong need to be admired by others. When controlling for demographic variables, the specific subfactors of left-wing authoritarianism associated with narcissism were anti-hierarchical aggression and, to a smaller extent, antagonistic narcissism. That is, those who agreed with the, quote, forceful overthrow of the established hierarchy and punishment for those in power, anti-hierarchical aggression, and agreed with the statement, quote, I want my rivals to fail, were more likely to be narcissists.
It is not enough to succeed. Others must fail.
Their second study did not find a relationship between narcissism and anti-hierarchical aggression, but did find a relationship between narcissism and the 2 other aspects of the dark triad, Machiavellianism, and to a stronger extent, psychopathy. And after controlling for other factors, including commitment to social justice activism, only psychopathy remained as a predictor of left-wing authoritarianism. Virtue signaling was related most strongly to the top-down censorship aspect of left-wing authoritarianism, but was also related to the anti-hierarchical aggression aspect of the LWA. In total, psychopathy was related to left-wing authoritarianism in general, but not to left-wing political orientation. That is, not all people who lean to the left are high in psychopathy, but left-wing authoritarians are high in psychopathy. People who are high in psychopathy are utilitarians only when it is self-beneficial, but not when it is beneficial to others, while being less altruistic in practice as it concerns donations to charity. Taking together the findings of the studies that we have just discussed, I have proposed a theoretical model for the relationship between left-wing political orientation and/or Democrat Party membership with authoritarianism, identification with all humanity, and psychopathy to predict outcomes of justifications for violence, use of unrestricted tactics in warfare, and utilitarian moral judgments. The only part of the model that is fully hypothetical here and not evidenced in existing scientific data is the relationship between outgroup identity fusion and identification with all humanity. However, given the negative relationship between identification with all humanity and right-wing authoritarianism, consistent outgroup preference expressed by people who identify as left-leaning, and the weights at all moral circles analysis, I would be very surprised were this relationship not both positive and significant. Another mental health condition that has been associated with ideological obsession and subsequent political violence is, perhaps unsurprisingly, obsessive-compulsive disorder. as found by Adam Troyan and Bellinger 2023 in a sample of environmental activists, Democrats, Republicans, and Muslim activists. For Democrats and Republicans, OCD symptoms were related both indirectly to violent activism to a small degree, 0.07 and 0.08 respectively, but much more so when mediated through obsessive passion for politics. For Muslim activists, however, the relationships were very strong, with both direct and indirect relationships between OCD symptoms and Islamist radicalism, and a rather astonishing correlation between OCD symptoms and obsessive passion of 0.9, which was then correlated to Islamic radicalism at 0.5. It likely comes as no surprise that mentally ill people are, well, mentally ill, and thus more prone to violence in some instances, depending on the mental health disorder. Numerous studies and surveys have illustrated that people who lean to the left ideologically tend to have poorer mental health, as seen in a meta-analysis from Kierkegaard 2020, who found that extreme left-wingers are 150% more likely to have a mental illness compared to moderates. These kinds of findings are often explained as being due to more left-leaning people also being more accepting of therapy and mental health intervention, resulting in an underdiagnosis of conservatives, and Kierkegaard's study confirms that conservatives are less likely to seek treatment for a mental health condition or ever having sought counseling, but they are also less likely to self-report experiencing days of poor mental health. As such, while it is possible that conservatives are just underdiagnosed, if they do not report feeling in poor mental health, then that would explain why they do not seek treatment for it. The group that was least likely to have ever had a mental health problem, and the second least likely to have ever received treatment, were moderate Republicans, while those most likely to report ever having had a mental health problem and a diagnosed emotional mental disorder, in turn, were strong Democrats. Other research, such as that from Schaffner et al. 2025, confirms that liberals consistently report far worse mental health than do conservatives, but also that liberals are more likely to report being in an excellent or very good mood, which may be where some of this belief concerning conservatives and mental health diagnoses originate. Conservatives likely seem to be, and are, in a worse mood than liberals, but they are less likely to be affected by serious mental health disorders, both in self-report and in official diagnoses. Taking all of this together then, we are talking about a portion of the population with significantly higher rates of reported and diagnosed mental health disorders who seem to favor a particular type of moral reasoning, utilitarianism, and place their moral emphasis on all of humanity rather than on specific groups. And when those two ways of looking at the world are combined with a mental health condition, specifically psychopathy, you have a recipe for moral reasoning that prioritizes only the self at the expense of all others for the purported purpose of the greater good, which one does not actually possess, outside of desiring a greater good for the self, the individual, effectively virtue signaling. The types of groups that these same people do identify with, when they identify with a group over all of humanity, are not those of their native culture, but rather those of outgroups. This outgroup preference, combined with utilitarian thinking, is related in turn to personal intentions to engage in violent political action and support for unrestricted, unethical, Geneva Convention violating tactics in warfare that are unafraid to target civilians under the auspices of the greater good. While in terms of actual rates of completed violent acts, right-wing groups have caused more loss of life and injury over the last several decades in the US, but it is the left that plans more violence in both the US and the UK. Further, attacks planned by the left are less likely to result in the loss of life and limb, not due to a lack of malice, but seemingly due to a lack of competence. As such, while it appears from a low-resolution perspective that the right is more violent, a higher-resolution view reveals that the left is just as violent, if not more so, likely due to the utilization of utilitarian moral reasoning and identity fusion with outgroups combined with the prevalence of mental health issues. And the differences in actual harm do not seem to be caused by a lack of violent intent, but rather by a lack of competence and the ability to translate their violent thoughts into real-world violent action. Thus, knowing as we now do the mechanisms of beliefs, thoughts, and words that all connect to the perpetration of political violence, and how the left has unique factors associated with its belief system that seem to attract people who are more likely to be mentally ill, utilize utilitarian, for the greater good moral reasoning, tend not to prefer social in-groups over out-groups in choices of ethical decision-making, and are more willing to use any means necessary to attain their political goals. Let's come to a few conclusions about the ugliness of politics. While it is impossible to truly know the number of violent attacks planned but never carried out by various political groups, to really be able to fully illustrate how much more violence would emanate from the left were they as competent as the right. Current trends in the US indicate that left-wing violence has surpassed violence from the right, meaning we could hypothesize that the number of planned attacks are many times higher than those actually carried out or reported. Further, given that violence is more common in countries where people feel politically disenfranchised, we could expect the next several years of Trump's presidency to be met with increasing left-wing violence. Once again, it has already surpassed the right, not even one full year into Trump's second term. As to the veracity of that Roald Dahl quote I began this video with, it is obvious prima facie that those on the left seem to be drawn towards certain psychological markers such as unnatural hair colors and facial piercings, identifiable both by their in-group and those on the outside, that signify their politics, and simultaneously are considered physically unattractive. Additionally, machine learning seems to indicate that even without vibrant hair, piercings, and other intentional choices to change one's physical appearance, women, at least on the left, are less physically attractive than are women on the right. This ugliness on the outside does not appear at first glance to translate to increased rates of violent attacks, resulting in similar numbers of death and injury compared to the right, however. But while right-wing violence is more injurious, if anything, the totality of the data indicate that the left tends to have more violent intent and endorse more extreme, unrestricted forms of violence. The difference in violence between the left and the right is one of competence. This intent is driven by a series of factors that are more common amongst left-leaning individuals, namely identity fusion with outgroups and a preference for outgroups, utilitarian moral reasoning, and identification with all of humanity when mediated through the presence of psychopathic traits and mental illness, also more common amongst leftists. In principle, caring about the good of the global many more than the good of the local few, and professing a love for the abstract concept of humanity over a love for family, friends, and nation certainly at least sound morally good, but in practice, people whose moral framework is utilitarian and universalist, whose identity is fused with outgroups rather than in-groups, and who have an increased propensity for mental illness, utilize said framework not for altruistic endeavors, but rather for ego-driven motives, being more willing to sacrifice others, particularly those of their shared in-groups, in order to save others only when their own lives are at risk, while also being more supportive of violent, extremist political action to defend outgroups. This psychological profile is uniquely leftist, resulting not only in hateful thoughts and toxic words, but ultimately in slightly more plans to enact violence, at least so far as detectable in mass-scale data analysis. This is the ugliness of the current leftist gestalt. Ugly ethics, ugly thoughts, ugly words, ugly appearance, and ultimately, ugly actions. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think the findings I was able to pull out of the terrorism databases concerning incomplete and non-injurious attacks from the left actually indicates more violent planned action than on the right? Or is this a data artifact consistent across both the US and UK by sheer coincidence? Or is it explainable by some other factors? Have you noticed lower levels of physical attractiveness of those who identify with left-wing politics? Or is that really all just in the eye of the beholder? Which group have you found, in your personal experience, to be more vicious in their words and thoughts? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, as it really helps this video out in the algorithm. While you're down there, please also consider giving the video a like, subscribing if you're not already subscribed, And if you really enjoyed this presentation, consider supporting my work by becoming a channel member to get custom emojis for premieres and comments, or on Patreon or Subscribestar. Supporters get access to my Discord where I preview these videos before they go live so we can chat about the topics in greater detail and get their names in the credits of every video, along with these fine folks here. If you would like something more tangible for your support, you can also check out my merch store for social science swag. You can hear more from me on my weekly news and politics podcast, Broken Crown, linked in the description, along with a link to my sponsor, Manta Sleep, to supercharge your slumber. Thank you all so much for your support. Stay safe, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.